Get your ears wrapped around the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast. All the scoop you need to know from college basketball to the NBA and even March Madness. News of your rising stars. Topics on and off the hardwood. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast.
What's going on, everyone? You're listening to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Foreman, and we're getting more and more news from the NBA getting released, as we approach the return of play in Orlando. The latest news to drop is the schedule to the 8 seeding games. So I want to start out by talking about the hardest and the easiest schedules in those 8 seeding games. I also want to discuss who I think is going to make that 8th seed in the Western Conference as well as the Eastern Conference. And if you guys didn't know, it's coming up on 10 years since LeBron James made the move from Cleveland to Miami. So I want to talk about that and a couple of other things that go along with that. And then make sure you guys stick around to the very end because I'm going to have a little bit of a hypothetical debate there with myself about the 96 Bulls and the 2017 Warriors, who in my opinion are two of the best teams that have ever played in the NBA. So I'm going to discuss those two teams, which team I think is better and which team I think would get the edge on the other in a 7-game series. So make sure you stick around to the very end of the show. But like I was saying, I want to start out with those 8 seeding games and which team I believe has the easiest and the hardest schedules going forward. So let's start out with the hardest schedules. Let's start out with the ones that have it tough. The first team to come to mind is the Denver Nuggets. Let's break down their schedule. So they play the Clippers, the Lakers, the Miami Heat, the Oklahoma City Thunder, as well as the Toronto Raptors. So they're playing the Clippers, Lakers, Heat, OKC, and the Raptors. 5 easily playoff teams right there. Obviously, they're only playing 8 games. So out of the 8 games, they're playing 5 notable playoff teams that are clearly in the playoff race and already established themselves as a clear playoff contender. Not saying you know what I mean. Establish themselves as a playoff team. It's no debate whether or not they're going to make the playoffs or not. So Denver has got to play Kawhi, Paul George, and the Clippers. Going to play LeBron, Anthony Davis, and the Heat. LeBron and Anthony Davis and the Lakers. Jimmy Butler, Bam Adebayo and the Heat. Chris Paul in the Thunder, and then Siakam and that team they have down in Toronto. So Denver's definitely got a tough schedule going forward. 5 of the 8 games. Definitely toss-ups, if not games, they aren't necessarily favorites in. Maybe in the Heat and OKC game, but besides that, not games they're probably going to be favored in. Next up, the Los Angeles Lakers. Let's go through their schedule. They have to play the Denver Nuggets, like I just said. They also have to play the Houston Rockets. They have to play the Los Angeles Clippers. Then they have to play the Oklahoma City Thunder, as well as the Toronto Raptors. So pretty similar to the Denver Nuggets in their schedule. 5 established playoff teams. Out of the 8 games, they have to play 5, obviously, high-level teams. They got to play James Harden and Russell Westbrook and the Rockets. Then basically just the same teams I listed out prior then. But obviously, tougher schedule. Obviously, like if you listen to my podcast in the past, You've heard that I do think that the Lakers will win the NBA Finals. I don't think they should be favored as high as they are favored right now. But, since they are the number one seed in the Western Conference, it makes sense that they're giving them a harder route. Why would they give LeBron an easy route to that number one seed? Why not make it a little interesting with them and the Clippers? Because in my opinion, the Clippers have a slightly easier schedule than the Lakers do. So maybe they're trying to mix up and see who gets that number one spot. But nonetheless, the Lakers are having somewhat of a difficult schedule in those 8 seeding games. Another team, sadly that does have a pretty difficult schedule is the Memphis Grizzlies, a team in the 8th spot right now. Obviously, they are 3 spots ahead of the Pelicans and the Portland Trail Blazers. However, not a team that always looks like it, not a team equipped like those other teams I just listed, like the Trailblazers and the Pelicans. However, they have a young star in Ja Morant leading them this season. As I've said in prior podcasts, they're going to go as far as Ja takes them. Very young, up-and-coming team. The fact that he's gotten them to that 8th spot at this point is very impressive. However, they do have somewhat of a tough route to make, to keep that 8th spot. They got to play Boston, the Boston Celtics, Milwaukee Bucks. They also have to play the Pelicans, the team, chasing them. They have to play the Oklahoma City Thunder as well as the Toronto Raptors. So, yeah, Memphis isn't necessarily going to be able to hit cruise control and make that 8th spot. They're going to have to turn it up and play some high-level teams and upset some teams because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of their 8 games are games they're not going to be favored in. Clearly, that's not up for debate. So 5 out of the 8 games, they are clearly the underdog there, so they have some slack to make up for. Ja's really going to have to, produce and overproduce for them. It's going to be a little harder for the Memphis Grizzlies. They got, like I said, they got Boston, the Bucks, the Pelicans, the Thunder, and Toronto. Yeah, that 8th spot definitely is up for grabs. Next up, let's talk about the Portland Trail Blazers. Also, somewhat of a notable, difficult schedule in these 8 games. Also have to play the Boston Celtics. They got to play the Dallas Mavericks, Denver Nuggets, Houston Rockets. They got to play the Clippers, and they have to play the 76ers. So there are 6 games alone out of the 8 that they are not going to be favored in. Okay, maybe they can pull an upset over Dallas and Denver. I don't see them beating Boston, the Rockets, or the Clippers. Probably not even the 76ers. Let's see what shape Embiid and Simmons are in, what kind of chemistry they have. But again, I don't like Portland's chances in a lot of those games. Again, 6 out of their 8 games, they are not favored to win. So, yeah, Portland is, as well as Memphis, those 2 teams are kind of going to be clumped together in having a harder path to get to that 8th spot. I don't want to talk about it too much because, I want to make sure you guys stick around to the next segment where I'm really going to dive deep into those 8th spot and the teams in the hunt. One more team, in my opinion, that really does have a tough schedule. Toronto, the Toronto Raptors. If you've been listening, I've said their name a lot in these past teams that I've been naming. The team that you've been hearing kind of a lot is the Toronto Raptors. So yeah, let's talk about it. The Raptors are playing the Boston Celtics, the Denver Nuggets, the Los Angeles Lakers, Miami Heat, Milwaukee Bucks, and the Philadelphia 76ers. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teams. Again, not 6 teams that they are going to be the underdog in, not 6 teams that they are necessarily inferior to, but 6 teams, 6 games that are going to be tough for them to win against high level competition. They don't necessarily have 4 or 5 games like some other teams I'm going to talk about that seem to be kind of easy wins, somewhat of an easy path to make the playoffs. But yeah, Toronto having to play Boston, the Lakers, the Heat, the Bucks, and the Sixers. That's going to be tough. They have a pretty young team. Obviously, we saw them win the finals last year with a Kawhi Leonard, not having him. Let's see if they can withstand this tough schedule and keep that number 2 spot in the Eastern Conference. I see them winning at least half of these games. I also see them dropping half of these games, but then they also have 2 remaining games. So let's see how they can do. But yeah, Toronto also, as well as the others, have a pretty tough path. All right. Now we've talked about some teams that have a harder and a tougher path to the NBA Finals, or sorry, the NBA postseason. Let's talk about some teams that kind of have an easier path and might have a better chance of making the playoffs. Again, I don't want to talk about it too much right now, but the New Orleans Pelicans, okay, they have to play the Clippers, but after that, no really big notable teams after that Clipper team. They have to play Orlando a couple of times. They play the Kings. They play Memphis, a team who I think we'll get into that. They play Memphis. They play the Spurs. They also play the Wizards. So they have one game where they are clearly the underdog against the Clippers. But besides that, I see some very winnable games for Zion and the Pelicans. Like I said, they play Orlando, the Sacramento Kings, Memphis Grizzlies, Spurs, Wizards. So yes, some very winnable games there for the young Pelicans. Not too many tough ones. So first up for the easy ones, I think the Pelicans have not an easy path, but easier than most to make that postseason. Another notable team that kind of has an easier path could be the Boston Celtics. They play the Brooklyn Nets, the Memphis Grizzlies, the Orlando Magic, the Trailblazers, the Wizards. 5 games where they are clearly clearly favored to win. Okay, they're not inferior to any of those 5 teams I just listed. So they're 5 out of those 8 games for Boston. They're the favorite. Okay, so Boston, very similar to the Pelicans. Obviously they have a couple of games in there. I think they get to play the Bucks once, maybe the Heat once, but still, a lot of winnable games out of those 8. 5 very winnable games. I see Boston doing very well in the 8 seeding games, possibly moving up, maybe taking that number 2 spot from Toronto, since, like I just said, Toronto kind of has a little bit of a tougher path, having to play. They do have to play Boston. Obviously, Toronto and Boston will play each other. We'll see who gets the best out of that matchup. But then Toronto has to play the Lakers, the Bucks, the Sixers, Denver. Not teams Boston has to play. So, yeah, it's going to be easier for the Celtics to move up. We'll see if Toronto can keep that number 2 spot. But another really easy schedule, and one that I think is really going to help this team in particular, is the Philadelphia 76ers. If you listened last week, I talked about the 76ers, and it's no doubt that they do have some chemistry issues with their 2 stars. They've had health issues, so the fact that they are getting some very winnable games out of these in these 8 seeding games is good for the Sixers, good for that team chemistry, good for their team confidence. Let's talk about the teams Philly has to play. So Philadelphia has to play the Pacers, Orlando, the Suns, Portland, the Spurs, and the Wizards. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teams, which in my opinion, very winnable games, and which again in my opinion, Philadelphia is the superior team in those matchups. So 6 out of the 8 games, if again Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid are healthy, I see the Philadelphia Sixers being favorites in 6 out of the 8 games. I see them, taking advantage of that. And, I have them doing very well. But again, they play the Pacers, the Magic, the Suns, the Trailblazers, the Spurs, the Wizards. All teams not necessarily high up in the playoff rankings. The fact that Philly is so low probably has to do with them having an easier schedule, not kind of underperforming in the regular season. I see them kind of giving them a little bit of a break here in the 8 seeding games, since they've had some injury issues all season. They are, I think, only 6 in the Eastern Conference, which is pretty embarrassing for that talent of that team and the talent of the Eastern Conference. But yeah, I have them winning at least 5 of these games. I think, at least 5 of these 6 games, at least 5 of the 8 games, and doing very well, possibly moving up from that 6th spot, probably passing the Pacers. We'll see who's ahead of them. But yeah, I see the Philadelphia doing very well. favorited in a lot of their games. I have them doing well and moving up in the standings. But those are my teams who I think have an easier or a harder path to the NBA postseason. I think the Clippers also have a somewhat notable harder season, having to play the Lakers. I think they have to play Boston, maybe the Bucks, but still besides that, I think their last 5 games, they play the Trailblazers a couple times, the Suns, the Spurs. So I do think that the Clippers have they start out kind of hard, but then they kind of have an easier schedule towards the end, rather than a team like the Lakers and the Raptors kind of have a hard schedule throughout the entire seeding. So I'm interested to see what that has to do. I don't think we'll have too much movement in the standings overall. I think where teams are, at least higher up, they're pretty much safe. The Lakers are at least four games above the Clippers, 4-5. So I don't see them losing enough to lose that number 2 spot. Nonetheless, some teams have easier schedules. It'd be pretty cool to see the standings mix up, change from what they are now. But since we aren't having home court advantage, and we're only playing in Orlando, there's not that much of an incentive to get a higher seed, since they're going to be playing in the same arena no matter what. So not that much of an incentive to move up or move down, or not too big of a worry to move down, as long as you're not worrying of moving, out. So yeah, I see the standings staying pretty much the same. Nonetheless, even if they do change, wouldn't have that much of a difference besides at the bottom of those standings. But stick around. That's going to be it for this segment. When I come back, I want to talk about the 8th seed in the Western Conference and the Eastern Conference. And I want to talk about which team I believe has the best chance of making it in each conference. So don't go anywhere. I'll be right back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, guys, welcome back. If you missed it, I just discussed the seeding games to finish the regular season. So if you missed that, go ahead and go back and check that out. But like I said before the break, I want to discuss the 8th seed in the Western Conference as well as the Eastern Conference, because that's why, that is why they made these 8 seeding games. What I just talked about is that 8th spot and the hunt for that 8th playoff spot. It is really close in the Western Conference, not too close in the East, since, they only brought one extra team out East. But nonetheless, the whole reason, they did the whole 8 seeding games instead of jumping right into the playoffs is because the hunt for that 8th spot is so close, especially in the Western Conference. So, they didn't feel it fair to just declare the Memphis Grizzlies the 8th spot, having such a large part, about 20 games left in the season. Zion and the Pelicans and, Dame and the Trailblazers did have a chance at coming back and making that spot. They still do. But yeah, that's why we see those seeding games. And let's talk about those specific teams in the hunt and which team I think will inevitably make that playoff spot, or those playoff spots. Let's start out in the Western Conference, and I'm just going to be blunt and come out and tell you guys the team I think will win. I believe that the Pelicans, the New Orleans Pelicans, will be the 8th spot. And if you have listened in my prior podcasts, I'll tell you right now, I was not a huge believer in the Pelicans, them making this 8th spot. Even when I found out, there are going to be 8 seeding games. Didn't like their odds. They are 3.5 games behind the Grizzlies as well as the Trailblazers, and so are they. Nonetheless, they're in the hunt, and I do think they do have a chance at making that 8th spot. Mostly because of what I just talked about, their schedule in the 8 seeding games. I think they have a much easier schedule when you compare them to the Portland Trailblazers, as well as, when you compare them to the Memphis Grizzlies. I'll go ahead and pull it right back out. But Memphis has to play, the Boston Celtics, the Milwaukee Bucks. They also have to play the Pelicans, who I think the Pelicans have they are the superior team in that matchup. They also have to play the Thunder and the Toronto Raptors. Portland has to play Boston, Dallas, Denver, the Rockets, the Clippers, and the 76ers. So 6 teams. They are the inferior team. They're the underdog in 6 out of their 8 games. And then, like I just talked about, the Pelicans, in contrast to those other teams, have 1 tough game and then have 4 games that are very winnable against teams that are low in the playoff hunt or low in the playoff race in the playoff standings. That has a big part to do with it. I do think the Pelicans have an easier route than the teams behind them. Teams like the Phoenix Suns and the San Antonio Spurs, I'm not really giving them a chance. I don't want to be blunt or too blunt, I don't want to be rude. However, they are so many games behind. They're behind the Pelicans as well as the Trailblazers. So I don't see them passing up either of those teams, let alone the Grizzlies. No matter what, even if I like Devin Booker a lot, I'm not a big fan of his supporting cast. I'm not sure on his co-star in DeAndre Ayton, and not a big fan of that whole roster in Phoenix. So I don't like Phoenix's chances. I also don't necessarily like the Spurs' chance. LaMarcus Aldridge is sitting out. They already are low in the playoff hunt. Simply the respect to the Spurs roster, them being 6 games back, is why they were brought back, obviously. But with LaMarcus Aldridge sitting out and him being the focal point of that team, in exception to DeMar DeRozan, I don't see them doing very well in their games. I think they have a somewhat not a hard schedule, but by no means is it easy, especially without their main guy in LaMarcus Aldridge. I don't like their chances either in the Western Conference. So like I was saying, I really like the Pelicans' chances. Memphis and Portland, the teams that are closest in the hunt behind them, also have tougher schedules, much tougher schedules. I do think that the NBA, I think they want Zion in the playoffs. I think not the whole reason, but a big part of the 8 seeding games is yes, teams are close, like the Trailblazers and the Pelicans. But they want to see Zion Williamson in the NBA playoffs, his rookie year, against the Los Angeles Lakers in the first round. Anthony Davis against his old team that traded him to LA. Then you got then you got Brandon Ingram, Josh Hart, Lonzo, guys that, were just traded from LA to the Pelicans, for that guy Anthony Davis. So that's the best storyline, the Pelicans against the Lakers in the first round. I think that the NBA is somewhat setting it up to be that way as well. I don't blame them, because I think that would also be the most intriguing and interesting matchup of the first round. I don't give Zion and the Pelicans too big a chance against LeBron and AD, but nonetheless, I think they would make it interesting. Like I said, it's the best storyline, and it'd get the most ratings out of that first round, out of any first round matchup. Again, besides, I really like Philadelphia and Boston if they end up matching up first round. But either way, I don't think they would get the ratings Zion and the Pelicans against LeBron and the Lakers would get. So the NBA knows that, they know their ratings more than anything. I bet they know that number down to the fine line, and they know Zion first round equals lots of people watching, lots of eyeballs. Let's talk about the Pelican team and why I do have such faith in them. So First up, Drew Holiday, veteran presence, shooting guard, point guard, whatever you want to call him. Nonetheless, this year averaging 19, 20 points a game, 7 assists, 2 steals. Veteran guy who just somewhat got extended by the team. Not a guy, not necessarily a big star, a big name. However, a big underrated guy, in my opinion. Has done a lot for the Pelicans, and not a guy you should necessarily underestimate. Like I said, 20 points, 7 assists, and 2 steals. They also have a guy in Brandon Ingram, averaging 24 points. All-star this year, obviously up-and-comer, up in the talks for the Most Improved Player Award. Then they have a guy in Lonzo Ball, 12 points, 7 assists, 6 rebounds. And if you were watching the season before it, had an abrupt stop, Lonzo was playing some of his best basketball of his career, averaging about up to 18 points a game. Assists and rebounds were about the same. I think they were about 8 instead of 7 and 6. They're about 8 and 7. But nonetheless, scoring more than ever. Lonzo was before the season stopped, so I think we might see pretty much the same from him. Hopefully we see about the same from him coming back. However, he has been a pretty spotty, shooter in his career so far. And then we all know Zion Williamson, about 23 points, 7 rebounds. We know the presence he brings on defense and offense, on transitions, fast breaks. We know what he does. We know what he can bring to a team. An exciting player to watch. Everyone wants to watch him when he's on the court. And, we know what he brings to a team. He is the focal point, the biggest reason I had the Pelicans making that 8th spot, that and the easier schedule. So, I have the Pelicans making it out west. Let's talk about the Eastern Conference now. So, out east, I think Orlando is going to move up to the seventh spot since Brooklyn's going to have so many injuries, obviously, losing that head coach. Wilson Chandler sitting out. They did add Tyler Johnson. Either way, I don't see Brooklyn doing very well. But the Wizards are 6 games behind that 8th spot. So it's going to be really tough for the Wizards to climb up in the rankings and make that. And their schedule really isn't doing them any favors. Let's talk about who the Wizards have to play. So the Wizards are playing Boston, the Bucks, the Pelicans, the Thunder, and the 76ers. So somewhat of a notably hard schedule there. We'll see if John Wall is returning. That has kind of been a looming question as well, but more recently we really haven't heard any news, and that really isn't a good sign unless he's trying to make a surprise and, make a splash and surprise everyone down in Orlando. But I don't necessarily see him returning. If he did, I do give them a much higher chance. Hopefully Bradley Beal's 100%. But like I just said, they have a tougher schedule than the Nets do. The Nets have a somewhat easy schedule. They have to play Boston, but besides that, they play Orlando a couple of times. They play the Trailblazers, the Phoenix Suns. So even though the Nets do have a kind of depleted roster, not having any stars on the team, I like their chances because of the matchups they have and of their lead in the conference right now. 6 games ahead. They'd have to drop 6 out of the 8. They'd have to drop at least, like I said, 6 out of the 8 games. And Washington would have to win at least 6 out of those games. And like I said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of their 8 games are teams they are the underdog in. Don't really see it with Washington, even though I would love to see them make the 8th spot. I would love to see John Wall come back, see him and Bradley Beal, see if they still got that chemistry, see if they can still play with each other at a high level. They never really had a chance. They never have really played at their peaks together in their primes. I don't think John Wall is. I think he is out of his prime somewhat due to all the injuries he sustained. But if he did come back, it'd be really interesting to watch. I think they'd win some games. Really unlikely, though. The Nets have an easier schedule. So like I said, I have Orlando moving up to the 7th spot, Brooklyn sliding down to the 8th spot, and pretty much everything staying the same out east. Maybe, like I said, Boston can move up to that 2nd spot instead of Toronto, since Toronto is having a tougher schedule. Maybe Philadelphia can move up from that 6th spot since they have a pretty easy schedule compared to other teams. Very interesting. Not too interesting in the East, but in the West it's going to be a race. Super cool. I'm super excited to watch and see what Dame can do. Can he pull off some of the upsets he's going to have to? Can the Pelicans win a lot of the games they're supposed to? Can Ja make some upsets happen and will the Grizzlies into the playoffs, using that 3-game lead he does have? Can he use that to his advantage? So, lots of storylines, lots of interesting stuff going on in the NBA right now. I think a lot of us are just waiting now until that day comes, July 30th. July 1st is the deadline. Wednesday is the deadline for players getting signed to teams. So on my podcast on Thursday, expect some more news, probably on, some free agent signings, if anything else happens. Hopefully it does. But either way, can't wait for basketball to return, July 30th. That playoff hunt is going to be insane. But like I said, I think I have the Pelicans making that 8th spot and pretty much everything staying the same out east. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to take a quick break. But like I said, when I come back, I want to talk about LeBron James. It's been roughly 10 years since his move to Miami from Cleveland. Well, at least it's coming up on 10 years. I want to talk about that move, if it was the right move, and what that move did to the NBA and the culture of the NBA. So don't go anywhere. I'll be right back.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back, guys, to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Like I said before the break, it's coming up on 10 years. If it's crazy to believe and think about, but yes, it's coming up on 10 years since LeBron James left the Cleveland Cavaliers for the Miami Heat. For me, that's one of the bigger memories, going back, of me, liking basketball, creating and, improving my love for the game. Had a lot to do with LeBron James. He was one of my favorite players growing up. And him moving to Miami is a big memory of mine. The decision and the fact that it was 10 years ago is really crazy to me. But nonetheless, it's been 10 years since the move to Miami. He left Cleveland, joined Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about if it was the right move for him, and let's talk about, what it did for the NBA in whole, in general. But yeah, LeBron joined Dwayne Wade. Let's start talking about him first. Dwayne was coming off a 26-point, 6.5 assists, 5 rebound season. The year prior was averaging 30 points, about the same assist-rebound ratio. Obviously, years prior, he won the championship with Shaquille O'Neal in Miami. So Wade, at that time, an established shooting guard, an established star in the NBA, had already had a championship, had already been an all-star for several years, up there in the scoring totals every single year, if not, leading the league. 30 points the year prior was his best year. So Dwayne, arguably in the prime of his career, if not, tail end of that prime, when LeBron James moved to Miami to join his friend. Chris Bosh, the other guy he joined, the other notable star, was coming off a 24-point, 11 rebound, 1 block season in Toronto. Him in Toronto kind of being the one star, not necessarily a powerhouse team or a contending team. A pretty good team in the Eastern Conference, but not a team that had a shot to win the finals. Similar to LeBron in Miami, LeBron in Cleveland, it was Dwayne in Miami, Chris in Toronto. None of the guys really had a big shot on their own, which, created the idea of, since we're all on our own, why don't we all go team up and see if we can do this thing together. So I think, it was definitely an interesting choice for LeBron. I do think it was time for him to leave Cleveland either way, even if he didn't end up going to Miami. The right move was to leave Cleveland because, it was obvious the management there wasn't going to do much, wasn't doing anything to put the pieces LeBron needed, made it clear that he needed around him to win. Kept seeing him either get swept in the finals. We saw him get swept in the finals. We saw him lose in the Eastern Conference finals again and again, either to Detroit or to Boston. So yes, LeBron needed some more firepower, some more help on his team. Cleveland was not getting it done, and it was pretty obvious that Cleveland was not getting it done. Either way, from the point of view of a Cleveland fan, from a team that was, supporting LeBron in his early years in Cleveland, a very heart-aching, surprising move, a move that a lot of people did not take lightly. We saw the burning of the jerseys. We saw, LeBron being seen as the villain of the league. We saw him somewhat thrive in that role as the villain and do very well when he went to Miami, obviously winning two championships and winning 2 MVPs there. But yeah, we saw what it did to Cleveland as well. As soon as he left, it was similar to before he got there. Irrelevant, basically. Back in the lottery, kind of looking to draft the right guy, usually not drafting the right guy until they kind of hit the lottery with a guy named Kyrie Irving. But this isn't about the Cavs. But either way, when he left, we know what it did to them. Completely demolished that roster, killed their chances of contention right away. But we heard the Cleveland Cavaliers' management saying they're excited for a new chance to start over, build a team their way. We didn't see it work out well. Didn't make the playoffs once. Was in the lottery the entire time. LeBron wasn't there. Very similar to what we see them now after LeBron left. But yeah, he made the right move getting out of Cleveland either way. But was it the right move to go to Miami? That's what I want to talk about right now. Was it the right move to go to Miami? There weren't too many other big options. There wasn't another glaring, highlight. Why didn't he go here? Like when he went to LA this year, it was, why didn't he go to Houston and join James Harden and Chris Paul? Or why didn't he go to the Philadelphia 76ers and team up with Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid? Why did he go to the Lakers on, that old or very young roster at the time? Now a very old roster, but at the time a very young roster, very unproven roster. So that move wasn't necessarily like this move. It was in the sense that he was on a depleted roster. Either way, didn't have the players and what he needed to compete. Obviously, we saw him make it to many finals, make it to those finals, and will that team to that finals in 2018. But yeah, we knew he didn't have enough. Very similar to why he left in the first place. He leaves again for a younger team, more up and coming team. But when he left the first time, there weren't really a lot of options out there like there was this time. The biggest name out there, one of the glaring options that people said, the biggest what if was if, he decided to not go to Miami and join Derrick Rose in the Chicago Bulls. Derrick Rose, obviously, the youngest MVP in NBA history, was pretty much at the start of the tear he went on, at the time LeBron was moving. That was when, Derrick Rose really started to elevate, especially the first year LeBron went there was his MVP season. So, we saw Derrick thrive that year. So if LeBron did end up joining him in his MVP season, do we see him winning MVP? Do we see him doing as well and thriving? Nonetheless, a guy in Derrick Rose who averaged 25 points, 7 assists. They had Luol Deng at the time. Only, that year he was only 25, 26 years old. So Luol Deng, a pretty young player at that point, also averaging 17, 18 points a game. Joakim Noah, the defensive anchor, defensive powerhouse, 11 points, 10 rebounds, 1 steal, 1 block. Also had the complimentary guy in Carlos Boozer, 17 points, 9 rebounds. Obviously an established player at that time as well, playing very well, very high minutes. So there are 4 guys playing very well. 4 guys playing at an arguably all-star level on the Chicago Bulls. Not necessarily having the salary cap as the Miami Heat at the time, since I did have all those players, but they were all young players. A couple of them did have contracts, but either way, if they could make the contract situation work, let's just say they could, what would that have looked like? LeBron James in the prime of his career joined with a Derrick Rose in the prime of his career, which, a guy in Derrick Rose is one of the biggest what-if stories in the NBA. Because, like I said, the youngest MVP in league history then goes on to tear both his ACLs, is not the same player ever again. Then we see him move from, Chicago to New York to the Timberwolves. Obviously now I'm happy he finally found a home, or a temporary home in Detroit, the Pistons, accepting his role coming off the bench as a 6th man. But either way, Derrick Rose is one of the biggest what-if stories out there. If to see him and LeBron in the prime of their careers playing together, I think it would have been a pretty cool sight to see. Chicago, I think, does very well. They don't have too many shooters, which LeBron kind of needs. Derrick Rose, not a guy really known for his shooting, but a very good roster at the time, a pretty good coach in Tom Thibodeau at the time. It would have been really cool to see those 2 MVPs playing together in the primes of their career. But who knows what that would have looked like with that the year after. Obviously we saw Derrick start the injury toll, start that process of wearing down. So maybe for 1 year it was cool for LeBron, but going forward, long term, multiple years, Chicago definitely was not the right choice. Since Derrick was out of the lineup a lot with those ACL injuries. So I do think LeBron made the right choice not going to the Chicago Bulls, A couple of other teams, notably, he could have went to. New York had Amari Stoudemire playing very well, averaging about 25 points. Melo was traded that year to New York. So maybe if LeBron tells New York, I want to come play, can we make this trade for Melo happen? Or maybe they talk and they tell LeBron, we're thinking about bringing in Carmelo. If we did that, would that increase your chances of him coming here? If it does, what if we see a Carmelo and LeBron James pairing up? A great shooter, LeBron, in Carmelo, a great distributor into LeBron James, one of the greatest distributors ever. So, we know what LeBron can do passing the ball. We know what Melo can do shooting and creating his own shot. So seeing those 2 caliber players playing together again in their primes of their careers arguably would have been very cool, very interesting to see. However, we don't know if that trade gets pulled off, if they sign LeBron. We don't know. It's a bunch of moving pieces. But if they could pull it off, LeBron and Carmelo, Amari Stoudemire in New York would be really cool, really interesting. I do think they're a contender very well, but long term, is it a long term thing? Like we saw, this is kind of with the Bulls, we didn't see New York in contention. Obviously, they needed a couple other pieces, one more piece. A guy like LeBron probably would have put them over the edge, obviously, but a very cool very cool scenario, seeing a couple of the Banana Boat guys playing together. That leads me to my next team that would have been super cool. What if LeBron James goes to the Los Angeles Clippers? Didn't have Chris Paul at the time. Maybe he goes there a year prior with Blake Griffin. They end up getting Chris Paul the year after. I do think him, Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan, JJ Redick, what a team assembled. That could have been assembled. Eventually getting the coach in Doc Rivers, not at the time, but eventually, if LeBron stays there with that group, a very big what if playing, with one of the best point guards in the league in Chris Paul, one of his best friends, in fact, at the time, one of the best power forwards in Blake Griffin, a very up-and-coming young player, establishing himself as a young star. a team that did have a lot of shooting. That added J.J. Redick. You know, they had shooting around them in Matt Barnes, J.J. Redick, Chris Paul, multiple guys who can put the ball on the floor and play. So LeBron to Los Angeles as well, huge market for him. Changes, you know, the Clippers franchise forever, getting that big of a star, similar to what we see them now, you know, with Kawhi and Paul George. Wow, what a team that would have been. Very cool what-if story. But again, do they get Chris Paul if LeBron gets there? Do they put all those pieces there if they sign LeBron with that contract? Who knows? Again, like I said, this is the scenario that everything falls perfectly into place. If he could go to the Clippers with Chris Paul and Blake Griffin, you had LeBron James. Wow, what a trio of guys. I do think they're in contention, even though they are in the Western Conference. I don't see that being too big of an issue for them, and I see them in a couple of years having success and also winning championships, plural. But at the time, you know, the time he made the decision, not knowing Chris Paul is going to the Clippers, not knowing Carmelo is going to New York, you know, a very young and up-and-coming team in Chicago Bulls, not yet the proven team they were that next year. LeBron made the right decision in going to Miami, joining the guys he did, Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh, some established stars, guys who knew how to win, simply needed to put the talent together, figure it out, you know, and we saw exactly that. We saw them win 2 championships in 4 years. LeBron win 2 MVPs, 2 finals MVPs. And then we saw what it did to the entire league. Last week I talked about my Bleacher Report released their all-decade awards. I did mine last week. And, you know, the biggest signing, the biggest, you know, move of the decade to me was LeBron to Miami, because it was the start of player movement, player mobility. You know, we don't necessarily see big players like Kevin Durant going to Golden State if LeBron James doesn't go to Miami in the first place and join up with those stars, you know, did what he did, creating that team. I don't think we see Kevin Durant doing that. I don't know if we see Kawhi and Paul George teaming up. You know, I don't know if we see this stuff happening. So LeBron going to Miami was the start of player mobility, changed the league, player empowerment, power to the players. Huge move for the league, biggest signing of the entire decade. And yes, LeBron made the correct decision, in my opinion. Joining the guys he did, established guys who could win right away and did win right away. Right decision. We saw the outcome, basically what we expected, not the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 rings they were expecting. Got to establish themselves as an all-time team. Did exactly, or almost what they were expecting. LeBron made the right decision. Let me know what you guys think. If he did make the right decision, what you guys thought of that. I know that was such a big move for the entire league, and we know what that did to the city of Cleveland. You know, what that did to that fan base and that roster. So, yeah, huge move. LeBron made the right decision. Either way, I want to go ahead and take a quick break, get a drink of water, but when I come back, I'm going to talk about the other big guy, Michael Jordan and his Chicago Bulls, and I want to discuss them and the Golden State Warriors, okay? So don't go anywhere. I'll be right back.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts. Past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
All right, guys, welcome back. Like I said before the break, I want to talk about Michael Jordan and his 95-96 Bulls and the 2016-2017 Golden State Warriors. Those are two teams that get brought up all the time in all-time discussions, all-time debates. Who is the best team all time? Shaq and Kobe's Lakers is another team that get tossed in there. But I want to talk about, these two teams, the Warriors and the Bulls. Michael Jordan's documentary a couple months ago finished airing. That was a big topic for a long time. They won 72 games. The Warriors won 73 games and then added Kevin Durant. So let's talk about these two teams. But let's start with the Chicago Bulls, led by Michael Jeffrey Jordan. That season averaged 30 points, 4 assists, 6 rebounds, and 2 steals. So we know what MJ does on both sides of the court. We know what MJ does every single night. We knew what he did every single season. There's a reason he's called the GOAT. There's a reason, everyone says no one can touch him. There's a reason, he is an all-time great player. And that season, nonetheless, averaging 30 points, going 72-10, at that time, the best record ever, being the best team ever, being called the best team ever from that point on. So we know what MJ did. We know what that team did. Let's keep talking about it. So Scottie Pippen, Michael's co-star, the Robin to his Batman, averaging, 19 points, 6 assists, 6 rebounds, basically 2 steals himself. So not only can Michael and Scottie do it on the offensive end, they can also do it on the defensive end. So let's remember that. Very two elite defensive players, two-way players who can do it on both ends at high levels. They also have a guy in Dennis Rodman. That season averaged a whopping 15 rebounds. We know what he did on the defensive end. We know what he did on the offensive and defensive glass, getting those boards. Being somewhat of a technician with the ball coming off the rim, being an elite rebounder. So we know what Dennis was, an all-time defender, if not the best rebounder ever. So that season he averaged 15 rebounds, only 5 points, but they didn't need him to score any points, basically. That wasn't what he was needed for. Then they had a guy like, Luke Longley, the center, in about 10 points, 5 rebounds. Tony Kukoc, the international guy, about 14 points a game, 3.5 assists, 4 rebounds. So very average play, very, very good play from a guy coming off your bench usually. Then, you have a guy in Ron Harper, an established point guard, an established guard, a guy who can also do it on both ends, offense and defense. And then also, you have a guy in Steve Kerr, one of the best 3-point shooters of all time. We saw the big shot he made, for the Bulls in that documentary. So I'm, kind of joking with Michael about it. Either way, an all-time great shooter. We know what he did for that Chicago Bulls team. So those are 7 of the guys who are, the highlights of that Chicago Bulls team. And then obviously the head coach, Phil Jackson, the Zen master, arguably the best coach of all time. In my opinion, he probably is the best coach of all time. In total, I believe he has 13 or 14 total NBA championships as a player and as a coach. So he has solidified himself as an all-time presence in the NBA, more obviously as a coach than a player. But he's won 13 championships out of the 70, 80 something that have occurred. So an all-time great coach, if not the best coach. So we know that Chicago Bulls team stacked, on the roster as well as coaching, that coaching staff. Let's talk about the Golden State Warriors, led by Steph Curry, one of the best shooting or one of the best point guards of all time, the best shooter of all time, probably the best 3-point shooter of all time. That season, in 2017, averaged about 25 points, 6 assists, 4 rebounds. And then his co-star, Kevin Durant, also an MVP, having 2 MVPs on the same team. the 7-footed monster, and Kevin Durant also averaged 25 points, 5 assists, and then 8 rebounds a game. Klay Thompson then, the best catch-and-shoot shooter ever, also a two-way player, very versatile, as with Kevin Durant, very versatile, a two-way player very much. Klay averaged about 22 points that season, and like I just said, we know what he does off the ball, at the three-point line, catching and shooting, and also on the defensive end. Draymond Green, a versatile 4, if not 5-man, would probably have to play the 4 in this case, depending on who the Chicago Bulls end up putting at the 5. Or, maybe the Warriors could put Draymond at the 5, force the Bulls to put Rodman on the 5. Rodman versus Draymond, very intriguing matchup, both about the same size. Rodman a little bigger, a little more physical, a little more beef on him, about the same height. However, Rodman the better rebounder though. So that would be a very intriguing matchup, very similar players in Draymond and Dennis Rodman. The Warriors also have an established guy in Andre Iguodala coming off the bench, Sean Livingston coming off the bench, JaVale McGee, an elite, in my opinion, an elite, shot blocker, a very good post presence, very good shot blocker. Obviously, Michael has played against the best of the best as far as shot blockers. Patrick Ewing, Karl Maloney's played some very good centers. So, Elijah Wan, he's played very, very good centers, elite guys who have paint presence, very high paint presence. So I don't think JaVale McGee by any means would really disrupt Michael Jordan. But either way, guy who gets a lot of block shots and a lot of rebounds. Then, an established veteran in David West coming off the bench, a guy like Matt Barnes coming off the bench. So very similar teams as far as depth. A lot of guys who can play, a lot of guys who have been there and done that. But it really depends, where they're playing, as far as, time and rule set of the NBA. Are we playing in this era? Are we playing back in the day in the 90s where you can hand check and, the game was much more physical? That does have to do with it. But either way, I do give the slight edge to the Golden State Warriors. And it's because, of the shooting ability that they have. And I don't think that the Chicago Bulls ever played a team to that capacity, that has that much firepower. But that season they ended up playing the Seattle Supersonics, a pretty good team that season, winning about 60-something games and, obviously making it to the finals, led by Gary Payton, Sean Kemp. But the Chicago Bulls went 6 games with that Seattle Supersonics team, which was not as good by any means as that Chicago Bulls team. Okay, they went 6 games with the Supersonics, and if they could go 6 games with the Supersonics, I think the Warriors can at least go 7 games with them and beat them. They have the best shooting, the best shooting talent ever brought together in Klay Thompson, Steph Curry, and Kevin Durant. Steph Curry, we know what he has done for the game of basketball, changing the game, moving the game outside the three-point arc. Kevin Durant, a 3-level scorer, a guy that can shoot at very high levels from the three-point mid-range and down low. Klay Thompson, like I just said, an elite catch-and-shoot guy. We saw him drop 60 points and 11 dribbles. We know what he can do in the offensive and defensive end. So those 3 guys, that's a lot of firepower. Michael Jordan, he's going to be able to defend Klay. He's going to be able to defend Steph. Scotty's going to be able to go get on Kevin Durant, But the thing with Golden State is, they have 3 guys willing to go somewhat nuclear on a given night. The Chicago Bulls really only have 2 high-scoring options in Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. Yes, Ron Harper can go get you some points on a given night. Tony Kukoc, same thing. Steve Kerr can get you some big buckets. However, not the third established star shooter, scorer that the Warriors have. Not as much firepower that the Warriors have. Let alone if we're taking this into consideration in this hypothetical crazy scenario, they got Steve Kerr as their coach, a guy who was on that Bulls team and has seen, what the Bulls can and can't do, or are good and aren't necessarily very good at. I think that the Bulls have a harder time scoring because the Warriors are still a very good defensive team. I don't think they have necessarily, Clay's a very good defender. Don't think he can stop Michael Jordan. I don't think Michael, you could put on Steph. You could put Scotty on Kevin Durant, but who's going to guard Clay? Not an elite defender who could guard Clay. Or if you put Michael on Clay and Scotty on Kevin, or vice versa, one of those three guys isn't going to be able to get locked down. And if they are, Michael and Scotty putting so much work on the defensive end, can they do as much work on that offensive end? So shooting, I got to put the edge to the Warriors. Defense, the edge does go to the Bulls on defense because of the presence they had: Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, three very elite defenders. But like I was just said about the Warriors, they have a lot of versatile guys in Andre Iguodala, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant. A lot of guys who can switch. Very versatile. The league now is very versatile. We see more switching than ever. Warriors are very versatile, very high firepower, lots of talent on that roster. Two MVPs playing together. I gotta give the edge to Steph Curry and Kevin Durant. I think those two together would beat Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. Again, not just those two, but you got Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, Iguodala. I like the firepower of the Warriors. I think it's close. I think it goes at least 6 games, maybe 7 games, just because of the will of Michael Jordan and what he would do. I know he would go nuclear. I don't think anyone on the Warriors could stop him or shut him down. Clay could do a pretty good job of keeping up with him. Kevin Durant, if he needed to, could since he's so lengthy, could maybe disrupt him a little bit, but nonetheless, we know what Michael is on offense and defense. It's going to go 6 or 7 games. But, the Warriors went 15-1 in the playoffs. They beat LeBron James, Kyrie Irving, Kevin Love in the finals very easily. One of the best teams, if not, in my opinion. Again, I'm going to say this in my opinion. They're the best team of all time. I don't know if any team has the firepower or has the capacity of beating them in a 7-game series with no injuries. Maybe the Shaq and Kobe Lakers, and Shaq is so dominant down low. But again, they don't have the firepower that the Warriors have, and Kevin, Clay, and Steph. I don't think any team all time has the firepower that team has. It's really hard to compete with them. But if anyone could, I think the best chance would go to that Chicago Bulls team with Michael Jordan. But like I said, I give the edge to the Golden State Warriors. In my opinion, they are the greatest talent ever assembled. They are the greatest team of all time. They were a dynasty, winning 3 championships in 5 years. They could have won more. All-time great team. It's a shame, Kevin left, and I left the team. I do think that they could have won some more championships, even though they had some injuries, especially this year. You take 1 year off, then you bring Kevin back and Steph and Clay back, and I think they're right back in contention. So I think they continue to win if Kevin doesn't leave. Maybe they're in contention of that Bulls dynasty, winning 5-6 rings. Who knows? Like I've been talking about today, a lot of big what if stories. This as well as like that Chicago Bulls and Derrick Rose. This is another what if, what if these two teams matched up? What would that look like? Again, I give the edge to the Golden State Warriors. I would love to hear what you guys think all time. I'll put a poll out on Twitter, which is the best team all time. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, whatever social media you're on. We're most likely on it too. Please leave us a nice review. Continue to share the podcast. Please continue to support and listen to all of our hosts, Bryce, Nick, and myself. But as far as this episode of GSMC, the basketball podcast goes, that's going to be it. Make sure you guys stick around, like I said, for Bryce and Nick's, and then make sure you come back on Thursday, because I'm expecting to have some even more news on the NBA, given that deadline on July 1st of the players being able to be signed before the resumption of play in Orlando. So I'm expecting more news on Thursday for you guys. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.